Hi, my name is Ben. For our presentation this week, we did Chapter 5 of Mexicans in the Making of America.
And my name's Sage, and we worked on the Bracero wetback program.
Hi, my name is Ben Pluckan, and I'll be presenting first on Chapter 5 in the Mexicans in the Making of America. I did pages 123 to 136 of Chapter 5. Just some main points that I'll be going over was the wetbacks overwhelming the population workforce down south. It was seen as one of the biggest non-war invasions of the time. Wetbacks were also being preferred to over Brackeros, and there was disagreements between the United States governments and the Mexican governments over the border and just working environment in general. So the Bracero program creating wetbacks. So with many men going off and fighting the Axis powers during World War II, there's a gap in the agricultural industry due to many men and women who did work going to work in factories for higher paying jobs. The United States looked to their southern neighbor for help in the labor shortage so that they could supply the cheap labor. Between 1942 and 1964, Mexico provided 4.5 million workers. Many Americans did, however, worry about all the undocumented workers who are referred to as wetbacks. Wetbacks were overwhelming the Algo population, forcing the United States Justice Department to round up unauthorized Mexicans in 1954, which was called Operation Wetback. The fear of the wetback invasions echoed throughout the 1940s of the Axis and powers invading through Mexico. Because of all these undocumented workers, no one knew their history and who they were, so there's always a fear that they were working for the Axis powers. Proceeding. So the wetback movement. So wetbacks were those who didn't agree or sign what the Bracero program provided, and instead illegally stayed after the temporary 6 months or crossed the border illegally. The years following the war gave way for many Mexicans to immigrate to the United States, which resulted in an immigration official to say it was the biggest non-war invasion of that time. The movement of wetbacks coming to the U.S. was so big that some said even the Mexican army couldn't have stopped it, with most of the southern agriculture usually relying on those south of the border for work. Up until World War I, both governments thought of this as a labor migration when they crossed the border. After World War II, though, they thought of a more reasonable way to legitimize border crossing. There was a huge disagreement with the National Farm Labor Union, the NFLU, and the State Department about wages that they were giving to their workers and how they were saying it was way too low. The NFLU said that if they would lower their wages, they would lose their farms. They relied on undocumented laborers because they were okay with being paid next to nothing. Continuing, standards not being met. In 1943, there was a ban on Bracero entering the United States. Texas growers relied on the wetback laborers who were let in by Border Control and immigration officials. INS officials cracked down on this by deporting those who didn't harvest crops. INS also urged the Mexican government to strengthen their border control with Mexico. Instead, they were blamed for letting in wetback laborers. In 1947, the Bracero program continued, with more and more Mexicans coming to the United States. Being a Bracero, however, was not easy, with them being treated as animals. If you were unlucky enough to be sent to Arkansas, most of the Braceros who were sent there got little to no pay, with living in shacks and no medical help. It was labeled as borderline slavery. They wrote back to the Mexican president about the mistreatment. This, however, wasn't just the case with Arkansas, with Braceros workers being forced to work in 10-degree weather with no winter clothes. The railway Braceros were forced to pay 3.5% of their wages to the retirement fund, even though their life expectancy was around only 34 years old. And this would have made it near impossible for families back home in Mexico to understand and apply for their pensions. Murray W. Latimer who was the chairman of the Railroad Retirement Fund, suggested a law to be enacted to permit the funds to be transferred to the accounts of the individuals in the Mexico's Social Security Fund. When the next wave of Braceros came to the Mexican government and told them to obtain assurances from the United States that they would be treated with more human dignity and justice. Continuing further, border problems. So the International Executive Agreement in 1949 required Bracero employers to sign an oath to not employ illegal workers and supply all medical costs to braceros that they hire. Tensions arose, however, between the State Department and the Mexican government when there was a refusal of braceros to be recruited to the northern states, which basically meant lighter workloads, a better environment to be working in. Um, The State Department argued that if they weren't recruited at the border, they could be seen as wetbacks. Then, in 1948, the INS opened the border surprising both the U.S. and Mexican governments. Over 4,000 crossed the border into El Paso. They were then put under technical arrest and transported to cotton fields in West Texas and New Mexico. INS claimed that they did this due to Washington telling them to use their own judgment. INS denied allowing them illegal entry, but instead of deporting the immigrants, they were sent to work in farms that needed labor. This violated the Bracero program, which ended in a cancellation of the program yet again. After an investigation into INS and punishing those responsible for the border opening up, both governments were able to come to a solution to the disagreement. All who were let in were deported immediately. Border control was also enforced by adding more than 175 patrol agents. Talking more about Mexico and basically the villages that were left behind, they were depleted of all able-bodied men. Fields were also left unattended. A woman from a small village named Gallegos Gonzalez even wrote to the president saying it's a time of true poverty and how all these farmers have abandoned their government. Some further research that I did was talking a little bit more about Operation Wetback. So, the main reason why it was set in motion was due to someone named General Brownell promoting the crackdown of undocumented workers because it displaced domestic workers. They also seemed to spread disease and contributed to high crime rates, and this was according to calendar.eji.org. Um, there's also the blame of them getting paid very low wages, which again, like messed with those with legitimized documents unable to work. Is also seen as an invasion. So to counter this, INS went from state to state, deporting those without documentation, which again, like it's crazy. And nearly 1.1 million individuals were deported. The Mexican government and labor groups criticized this, but however, this did not matter with illegal immigration still like blowing up when the Bracero program ended in the 1960s. And this was according to immigrationhistory.org. And now Sage will continue with the
My
presentation.
name is Sage DeVincenzi, and I'm going to be talking about Chapter 5's Bracero program. So, my main points are the effects of immigration from Braceros on the economy, Truman's good neighbor policy, the attempts to end the illegal immigration, which consisted of 2 points: Operation Wetback and drawing out the wetbacks, and then the eventual end to the Bracero program. So, some of the effects on immigration on the economy was that many unauthorized Mexicans were coming into the U.S., and the villages in Mexico lost many quality workers. So, due to this, Mexican farmers couldn't maintain their levels of operation, which caused poverty. Many men in Mexico abandoned their fields to work on El Ocho Ladro, which is a binational legal aid program that served migrants and refugees in the US and Mexico. And because of this, many children in Mexico were left behind, and most of the population was left suffering with no resources because there was no workers to provide for them. So, with many Mexicans crossing the border, both wetbacks and braceros, um, it really ruined the economy in Mexico just because they lost so many workers. And the conditions crossing were pretty horrible. There was a lot of concerns that Mexico and Mexicans were physically sick, and 70% of the Mexicans were affected with syphilis, and they were considered dishonest and illiterate. So as you can see, they would spray them with pesticides and just treat them really poorly. there was a lot of backlash against Mexicans crossing because many Americans thought that as soon as the harvest was over, they were considered useless wetbacks and they were just taking up space. Truman's good neighbor policy wanted a friendly relationship between nations, but in order to get this, President Truman ignored illegal immigration and swore by the good neighbor policy and the doctrine of intervention, which is just referring to the U.S. protecting our national interests and intervening in the Mexican affairs. So the U.S. government contributed to the issue of illegal immigration by ignoring violations against immigration laws just to see out the interests of the main employers of wetback labor. So it was really all in the interest of our economy and not at all in the best interest of the workers of the Bracero program or the illegal immigrants that we knew were coming into the country. However, Truman wanted good living conditions for Mexicans, so he started a new Bracero program, and it stated that both governments have to stop illegal immigration. So, in order to basically put this into effect, fines and prison sentences of $2,000 and up to 5 years were put into place if you were an employer of an illegal immigrant or caught harboring an illegal immigrant. Those who were caught shielding or housing immigrants and undocumented workers face penalties. The Korean War also was a contributor to the demand for Mexican labor because there was an increased need for agricultural production, which meant that we needed more Mexican laborers to supply that demand. And unfortunately, even though we did have this new Bracero program working on giving better conditions, Texas immigration implemented the Texas Proviso, which exempted employers from penalties for holding undocumented workers and basically harboring them. So, on to the next portion where the Bracero program, it still was working to end illegal immigration. And when it expired in December 31st of 1953, there was an argument to not start it back up just because of the thousands of American farm workers that were unemployed and ready for work. But this was an invalid argument because these workers were not willing to do the backbreaking work that the Mexican workers would do. So, this being said, the new Bracero program started in March of 1954 with some changes to its original contract. So, there was new recruiting stations near the border, which in the past they were only on the interior of the border, which it encouraged laborers living near the border to cross illegally, which was just adding to the growing issue of illegal immigration. So by putting it on the outside of the border, that was an attempt to slow. This new program had two major operations to end illegal immigration, which were known as Drying Out the Wetbacks and Operation Wetback. So the process of drying out the wetbacks gave undocumented workers in the U.S. Bracero contracts without having to go home to Mexico first. And this led to more undocumented workers being legalized in the U.S. than Mexico, which became a motif for Mexicans to enter the U.S. without Bracero contracts. This was also due to the fact that Mexican authorities denied contracts to females, people that were too old, too young, too sick, or too poor to pay their bribes. There was a lot of bribing going on, which made it really difficult for people to obtain their pre-contract cards because there was only limited numbers. So they would bribe Mexicans and would sell them to the highest bidder, which caused many debt in Mexican immigrants. And the Mexican government knew of this and did not face punishments for any of the people involved. These pictures at the bottom of the screen are some examples of what pre-contract cards looked like. So Mexicans had to obtain these in order to legally enter the US to work. In the second part of this program, Operation Wetback, the main goal was to seal the border. This was due to the thousands of Braceros that had stormed the border. It was approximately 7,500 Mexicans. You could see a photo of it here. They stormed the borders to work on California farms. They wanted to work on harvests, and the Border Patrol wouldn't admit more than 500 Mexicans. So they stormed the border, many people got in, and this led to Border Patrol apprehending and deporting around 4,800 undocumented workers. This was in support by many Mexicans because it controlled the communist infiltration that there was speculation of at the border. They also did not pay mind to the fact that these immigrants were often rounded up like stray cattle and abandoned at the border without food, water, or shelter after they were the ones who helped fuel our harvests and our economy. This operation did slow down the flow of undocumented workers and was said to have controlled the border and secured it. So, the end of the Bracero program came in 1964 when it was terminated, and Mexico didn't want to end the Bracero program because of its rapidly growing population and they couldn't provide work for everyone. This being said, Americans said that wetbacks and braceros were a menace to their society, so they really pushed for the end of this program. In addition to this, they made many sanctions to stop unauthorized workers from being hired, but the U.S. eventually sided with workers needing cheap labor because Americans wouldn't do this kind of work, and they knew that they could always get willing workers from Mexico to carry out the work and feed our economy.